Well, when it comes to doing ministry, here's what we know. We have a lot of pre-assumptions that influence the decisions that we make, but not all of our assumptions are correct. And so today on Practical Church Planting, we're going to share with you 6 false ministry assumptions.
Hey, my name is Brian Brammer, and with me is Dylan Dodson. This is Practical Church Planting, and today we're talking about 6 false ministry assumptions.
And as we jump into that, this episode is brought to you by Mission Support. We're big fans of Mission Support and how they have helped a lot of church planters and our Practical Church Planting community. Mission Support knows you want to be effective in ministry, but like most pastors today, you probably feel like you never have enough time, energy, or expertise to get everything done. So Mission Support comes alongside pastors like you as a guide to provide expertise on the things you don't know how to do and give you back time you desperately need. So whether it's things like bookkeeping, SEO, websites, payrolls, capital campaigns, digital resources, there's a lot of things that probably drain you and you want help on. You can talk to their services. If you talk to their guides at missionsupport.com, and you can love being a pastor again. So missionsupport.com, and don't forget, tell them that you heard about them from Practical Church Planting, and you'll get 10% off any number of their services. So missionsupport.com. Tell them you heard about them from Practical Church Planting. You get 10% off. And just check out their website, if anything, and see if they've got some stuff that might be helpful to you. Now, today we're talking about false ministry assumptions. These are things that we assume for whatever reason or for various reasons that are true, and we want to encourage you that they're not true. And so hopefully that'll help you make some decisions that you're thinking through. So here we go. Number 1. That waiting is inherently more holy. So there's lots of, we all have our soapboxes in life and in ministry. This is one of them for me. It's kind of this assumption that if you want to do something, you must wait whatever the period of time before you start taking action. Now, hear me. There are absolutely times where you need to wait and to learn and to grow and to get training. Absolutely. But there's also times where, hey, when this thing is ready to go, it's ready to go. So let me give you a real practical example. I was on a call a couple weeks ago with a guy who's going to be planting the church, and his plan was to, I can't remember, his plan was to basically plant like 2 years from when our conversation was happening a couple weeks ago. And it was, he's been through assessment, he's an Acts 29 guy, we've talked and all these sort of things. And one of the things I said was, why are you waiting so long? Because we talk about this too in the podcast, the Growing and Launch Team course. Like when it comes to planting a church, when you're more than about 9 months out, it's really hard for people to join in on what you're doing because it just seems like so far away is it going to happen. And he was ready to go. He already started a small group Bible study. People were coming. And so basically, long story short, he ended up shortening his launch date to closer, which was in his situation really good. And so again, I think there was this assumption of, well, I'm going to do this. We're always supposed to quote unquote wait. And so no, if you're ready to take steps, you should take steps. And so waiting is not inherently more holy. It can be a good thing, but I think in ministry we just assume I want to do this thing. I therefore must wait however long before I start pursuing it.
Yeah, I've been on a couple of church planting teams, like in the beginning stages, and they were talking about, when are we going to do like a soft launch or a big launch? And those aren't bad things. Like a lot of stores have like a pre-grand opening and then a grand opening, which is like to kind of gauge interest. But for churches, it is a little different, but at the same time, it's the same thing because you're vying again for people's attention for that time block and their commitment level. And so if you've got people that are ready they're on board, they're ready to go, you're meeting in a house, like that could be a soft launch. Like, hey, I've planted a church. As far as like growing, getting space, that might be the thing that's like, okay, we're about to make a big investment. But there's, the church is where the people are. So yeah, it's one of those things where we waited we've been doing this for 5 years. Like, wow, okay, well then, God's going to bless your church more than others. It's just not a thing. I'm not sure where we get that idea from. You're waiting on the Lord, we hear, but in a lot of these cases with church plants, it's like, you got to plan, go for it.
Yeah. And so again, and it could be planning a church, and that's not to say, well, I feel like I'm supposed to plant a church and I'm going to do it next month. Again, there's seasons. You should have people speak into what you're doing, training, all that sort of thing. But it even could be like starting a new ministry at your church or any number of things that you might feel like compelled to do within your church or church plant, something, and you feel like, well, let me wait 6 more months. Now, again, I'm not trying to say you shouldn't pray and do these things. I'm just saying waiting in and of itself, we shouldn't view it as that's the better thing. And moving, if you're prepared and ready to move, is the bad thing. So it can be bad, but not always. So that's a false ministry assumption number 1. Waiting is inherently more holy. Number 2, sermon prep must be done on Saturday. So this is another, I feel like a lot of these are probably a little soapbox. This is for me. Yeah, I think this is, especially if you preach regularly, this is one of the biggest issues in terms of feeling busy, time management, stress, family issues, is writing a sermon on Sunday. We've talked about on the podcast before, like, again, this maybe this goes back to waiting is more holy. Like, you wait till the last minute, so therefore it's better.
Yeah.
Setting artificial deadlines so that you're done. So again, for me, we've got episodes in the past. I didn't look up the number of like my sermon prep process, and I'm not saying you don't need to do it my way, but for me, my sermon is done Thursday at 10 a.m. Like, that's my deadline. Now, I've got a whole process of how that happens, blah, blah, blah. And certainly there could be exceptions, although there really never, honestly, there never is. But it's like done. I could preach it. And of course, I review it a little bit on Saturday night or Sunday morning for about 20 minutes, just look through it and all that sort of thing. But it's like, it's done. I'm not working on it because I have moved up my artificial deadline so that I can have time with my family doing things that are important and not working. And so, again, if you're bivocational, that's a little bit different. But generally speaking, I think sermon prep's a problem because we don't have a system of doing it. And so we feel like I take longer and longer. And so whether it's preaching or whether it's other stuff that you have to do that's Sunday related, you should move up that artificial deadline if you can, so that you're not doing everything on Saturday.
Yeah, and to kind of echo that, it's I hadn't been to a point where I had preached on a regular basis, but I filled in the pulpit, quite a few times. And I kind of had that idea of, if I'm not, I can do my studying during the week, but if I don't like put X amount of hours on Saturday, it's almost like I'm going into Sunday without thinking about it, with the sermon being no consideration. It should be the last thing on my mind. Which, if that helps you, if you're one of those things where you're one of those people where I have to review it, go for it.
Right.
But it's not a necessary thing, or doesn't mean your sermon is going to perform better, or people's hearts are going to be open more because God knew you did it Saturday.
Right.
And so as Dylan said, if you are bivocational, you have to fit in with your schedule.
Yep.
But the last thing you want to do, since you talked about spending time with family on Saturdays, is neglecting your family to focus on your sermon. Then you go in on Sunday, and there's some, there's some wrestling in your heart because you didn't spend that time with your family, and so you're not going into your sermon with this, I think, a heart that's prepared. You're almost doing it somewhat as a duty. Yeah, and it is a duty as a pastor, but it's so much more than that.
Yeah, and kind of what you're saying too. I guess I should clarify. Reviewing your sermon is different. So if you need to, totally. But if you're working multiple hours on your sermon every single Saturday, generally speaking, of course, there's exceptions. If something happened, I get it. This is also why I'm a fan of getting ahead. So I'm typically about 4 weeks ahead. I mean, I still do a lot of tightening up that week, but this is a great example. Later today, I'm going to be out of town for a couple of days with a pastor cohort. And so this week, all I have to do is review my sermon that I'm preaching, but I'm not writing a new sermon because I'm ahead. So it really helps you on the weeks that you have things going on or there's emergency, that like you not have to spend this extra time. So anyway, that's a whole other thing, getting ahead. But getting things don't have to be done on Saturday, and I would, to the best of my ability, try to find ways to get it done. Now, I will say this, I think this is one of the things we do well at New City, one of the things I would encourage other churches to do, especially if you're the lead pastor or you're the one who's preaching. It's not just a benefit to you to be done before Saturday, it's a benefit to your team, because if you're trying to pick songs that are matched up to the sermon, or graphics need to be made, or there's certain things on Sunday that you're doing that are based on the sermon and you're last minute, or like Sunday morning, they can't put any of the sermon slides in until Sunday morning while they're trying to get everything, especially if you're portable too, get things plugged in, the band's trying to practice, so they can't use this ProPresenter or whatever you use because the computer's being used, putting those slides in. It's a lot. And so these are why these artificial deadlines can be really helpful, so that everyone else can also not be scrambling on Saturday. It's just fair to your other teams. And so that's part of it for us. So like, not only have I found it beneficial for me, but like Thursday morning I'm done. It's helpful because we, Brian, we print out outlines, like sermon note outlines, so you don't have to do that on Sunday. And again, it's not the end of the world to do that on Sunday, but things can happen. You could be out of ink. The printer could not be working. It's better to figure that out during the week.
Or you have someone that calls in from the band and they can't make it, so you have to fill in, and now it's like everything shifts. Well, we do one less song. I'm not sure if that's ever really been the case, but like, then there's this domino effect. Yep. So you go into the worship stressed, and that's not at all why we do this.
Yeah, and of course, things can happen where things kind of get out that are outside of your control, obviously. Mm-hmm. But my point is, the things that are inside of our control, we need to prep them as best we can. And so, trying to set those artificial deadlines. Saturday is not the best day. It's probably the worst day. Now, again, people can take different days off. I get it. But culturally speaking, Saturday is the day most people are off. If you have kids, they're not in school. And so just trying to be really cognizant of sermon prep must be done on Saturday is a false ministry assumption, or any Sunday related work, even if you're not preaching, you might have some things that you're doing. If you can get them done before Saturday, I think that'd be a good idea. Number 3, what you want to do is quote unquote wrong. What you want to do is wrong. It's actually interesting. So I read a book called The Coaching Habit early last year, and it was awesome. It was really helpful for me, especially with meeting with people, because when you meet with people as a pastor, there's often times where you feel like, I don't know what to say here. I don't know. And so you kind of feel like you weren't helpful. And I mentioned this, I think, in previous podcasts. In the book, The Coaching Habit, he has 7 questions that he asks people when he meets with them. I always ask the first 5. I mean, there's other questions I ask in the meantime, but when I'm meeting with people, and it's made things way better. And the things he talks about is I actually have them on my board because they've been on my board forever since I read that book. What's on your mind? So this will make sense in a second. But when you meet somebody, you say, hey, what's on your mind? And then they talk about for a little bit, and you can go back and forth, and then you would say, and what else? Because really, it's a little bit deeper than the issue that they're missing. Yeah. And then what is the real challenge here? So like getting them to after they've talked through it, like articulate what's the biggest problem. Then number 4, this is the big one. What do you want? And number 5 is how can I help? So the point is, what do you want? As you've talked through all these things, what is it that you actually want? Because here's the deal: even when we're meeting with people and we're maybe trying to give them advice or whatever, if they don't want what we're trying to help them with, it's not going to go anywhere. Even if what they want isn't the best. I mean, you can try to direct it, but just know if it's like, let me just tell you all the things that you need to do that's not really effective. And so anyway, what you want, and then how can I help you do that? Now, how this relates to all this stuff, so with X29, I get to be a part of, a lot of their assessments, and it's a privilege. And I talk to a lot of you guys through the podcast, which is awesome. And there's this idea that like, if I want to do something, it's not as holy because it's like something I like. And so one of the things I asked at assessment multiple times until like if people finally start to click is, what do you want to do? Like, what are for churches? Like, what are the ministries that get you really excited? Or what's the organizational structure, if that's your thing, that gets you really excited? Like, what are your passions? Like, you can't do everything that you want and enjoy is not going to be your job description. But here's the reality: if you as the leader are excited about it, then other people will be excited about it, just because it's kind of infectious. And so I would think through like, what do I want to do? What do I want this church to look like? What do I want this ministry to look like? What do I want my schedule to look like? And not just assume everything I want is bad. Of course, you want to follow Jesus and love your family and love your people well and all these sort of things. But I think if you are pursuing Jesus, your desires hopefully aren't all selfish and wrong or whatever. And so I would really press in, like, what are the things that excite me? And what would it look like to implement some of those in our church? Because again, if you are excited as a leader, other people will be excited as well.
It kind of reminds me, this is a throwback, showing my age as well, that old DC Talk song. It was like one of the last ones that came out when they were still together, called My Will. And basically, they were saying, if it's my will, if it's something I want, that's it's gonna, if I'm walking with God, what I desire and what I want is gonna be what He wants, And so it's not deeply theological, obviously, it's from a band, but yeah, just that idea of if you're being a godly leader, if you're pursuing that, you're not going to get it perfect, but you're pursuing that. Oftentimes, what you are wanting is going to align with what's going to be most beneficial.
Yeah. So let me give you a real practical example of this. So, coaching a guy a little bit ago, and he was meeting on Friday nights. So they're gathering a launch team, doing a Bible study on Friday nights. And so we were talking through this plan. I was asking him, like, what does he want this to do? What does he want it to look like? And there are pros and cons to anything. I just straight up told him, I said, I personally would not join a launch team that meets on Friday nights. With the ages of my kids, like, I wouldn't do it. But he's gotten some traction. And so we were talking about in the future, like the people that are there now really like it. It doesn't mean that new people are going to like it. But I said, here's the thing. I personally would not meet on Friday nights. But if you are stoked about Friday nights, I think you should do it. Now, there's pros and cons. It might be hard, might be difficult, but I wouldn't like pick. This might be a really simple example, but I wouldn't, the night that you meet with your Bible study, whatever. But I think that's important. Like, what do you want to do so it doesn't feel obligatory? And so, if you really want to do this, know that there might be some challenges that you face. But if it gets you excited, if it works well with your schedule and where you are and the people, then you should pursue it, even if I wouldn't do it that way. And so, I don't know, again, ministries, I mean, way you structure your groups, way you structure serving, even if you're, on staff at a church, lead pastor or not, how you organize your time or how you do certain, like, just how do I want this to operate? I think you'll have a lot more success and you'll enjoy it a little bit more if you don't try to suppress that, if that makes sense.
Well, you understand the assumption was what you want to do is wrong.
Right.
So it's obviously what Dylan is saying is almost like it's very circumstantial a lot of times.
Yep.
You may not want something, but you're like, but this is what God's called you to do if this is what you think is best for your church.
Yep.
I'm not saying you're wrong. That's not what I would do, but it seems like it's working
Yep.
great for you. So
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly it. So I can think through what are some of the things that I've might enjoyed or I think I want to pursue, but I felt for whatever arbitrary reason I wasn't supposed to do it. Now, there might be good reasons why you shouldn't do something. So don't just dismiss your desires as wrong offhand, because it could be, God leading you in a direction. And again, if you're pumped about it, it'll trickle down to other people. That was number 4. Number 5.
that was number 3.
That was number 3.
Yep, you're good.
Number 4. Your church will be a lot different. So I get it. So you see this a lot in church plants and smaller, maybe house churches, or again, when they're gathering a launch team or whatever, it's like talking about how different the church is going to be. And hear me, all churches have kind of their unique flavor and their differences. But here's how all churches end up, if we're just being honest. You're going to meet on Sundays, or most likely, you might pick another day, whatever. You're going to sing some songs, and preach a sermon, you might do communion, have some announcements. Like, your service is going to look pretty similar. The elements might be in a different order, different lengths, but you're probably going to have some sort of, at least how we do church today, and at least the Western context, some sort of group structure, some sort of serving structure. It might be organized, not all the same, but like the bones are very similar. And so I just would be cautious, especially in the beginning, as you're trying to, connect with people, and we're going to do church differently. It's like, well, once you kind of get established and you have more than like 15 people, or maybe more than 30 people, there are certain rhythms that are pretty normal. So now I would say this: it's easy in the beginning to say we're going to do things differently because there's less people. Now we're pro churches of all sizes. A house church model, you can do things a lot differently. You can do meals after the service, or everyone can go around and share, how God's been impacting them or whatever. That just doesn't work with 50 people or 100 people or whatever. And I'm not saying one is better than the other, but I am saying at the end of the day, again, there's theological differences, all that sort of thing, but like practically how it looks, at least from the outside, even if it's not true on the inside, a lot of churches function very, very similarly. So I hope you understand what I'm saying. Obviously, there's a lot of differences in governance structure and all that sort of thing, but especially if you're in the planting phase, I would be cautious of pushing, we're going to be so much different, because it does 2 disadvantages. One, if it's not always going to probably be like that, and so you kind of be like, hey, I was told that like this is going to be this radical thing, and then as more people came, we changed. But 2, it can come across unintentionally as if we're better. So everyone else has not figured it out and they're wrong. And even if that's not your goal, it can come across like that really easily. And so there might be distinctions, there might be things that your church is great at, and there might be church weaknesses of your church, like there are for all churches. But like this idea that we're going to be radically different probably is not going to be the case.
What's that saying? Is it perception is 9/10 the law? Or did I just make that up? Probably.
I have never heard
Brian
that, but it sounds
great.
It
But
sounds great.
as Dylan was saying,
As Brian Brammer says, perception is 9/10 the law.
now you got a little line in my name,
Yep.
and then Michael Scott.
Yeah.
So I don't even know where I was going with that. But yeah, so with
Perception is reality. I know
perception,
that one.
Yes.
So maybe that's
and
close.
so as he's talking about, when you try to explain the vision of your church to others, it's going to come across as, oh yeah, we're that's great what you're doing, but we're doing something better. We're doing something different. But maybe it might be different to leadership because of maybe a philosophy of ministry, but understand that's internal.
Yeah.
That could be like how you want to structure things. That's completely up to you and your leadership. That could look different, but on the outside, to the people that you want to come in, your partners, your members, whatever you call them, it is going to look very, very similar. And you don't want to use church is going to be different as a hook.
Yeah.
Like you don't. I'm not saying anybody intentionally uses it as a hook, but when you do things this way, and then they come and about 80 or 90% of it is the same as another church, they're going to seem like they're been a little duped, and that's not your intention.
Yeah.
And so it's almost like you just don't want to step into something that you didn't see.
That's good points. Again, this is, I'm not trying to Jesus juke or sound like super spiritual. Obviously, Jesus is the hook, not like how we're different is the hook. And so it can come across that way of like, you should come to us because we're different. That's the main draw, not, trying to follow Jesus. And the second thing, like Brian was saying, internally, you could look different. Like, do you have elders? Do you not? Are you congregationally led? Are you not? How's your group structure? How do you ask people to, whatever. But like from the outside, again, it's like you have a sermon, you have some sort of groups, you have some sort of serve team ministry, maybe you serve in the community, discipleship. Like from the average person who's not thinking about church every time, every day because it's not their job. Even though it is different, it kind of looks the same. And so when you're said, it just can come across as like you're going to do this radically different thing. Which again, if you're smaller, you can. But if you're going to be bigger than a house church, which again, we're pro house churches, just know that you have some limitations in like how different your service can be. And again, there's strengths and weaknesses to all approaches, but just be careful of that. So your church will be a lot different is a false ministry assumption. Number 5, you need a compelling reason to plant a church in your area. So we all know how this goes. If you've been interested in planting, talked about it, or if you are planting, or if you have planted, question you get is from Christians oftentimes, depending on your context, but still, I think even in churches with a lot of churches, you probably still get this. Why are you planting a church in this area? And the internal feeling you can get is I have to give them a compelling reason. So you think of like statistics, and here's how many churches there are. Now, we all know statistics don't move people at all. I'm not saying you shouldn't use them, but like leading them, like has a leading conversation, they're not going to get anywhere because like it's just like people's faces glaze over with statistics. But we feel like we have to give a really compelling reason. And in my experience, I mean, some people ask like they're just genuinely curious. They want to know your heart, your vision. But a lot of times, if people are asking that with like, I don't understand why you would want to do this. There is really no reason that you can give that they're going to be okay with, or maybe not that they're not okay with it, but they're going to be convinced by. And so you can kind of know that going into the conversation. My encouragement is this: again, at the end of the day, God is calling us to love God and love people, and you can do that in ministry, not in vocational ministry, whatever. But if you have a heart for an area and you've been meeting with people, decide people, maybe you're currently on staff at a church in that area, and you want to plant a church here. The reason we plant a church is to create more spaces for people to meet Jesus. And we all know, if you know how this works, that we could never have enough churches for the amount of people that don't know Jesus. Even if you're in a highly churched area, it's like, well, what do those churches look like? And even still then, it's like, 50% of even if you're like, let's say you're at a place where 70% of people on average go to church, which I don't know if that exists anymore. That's still 30%. Like, a couple hundred people, a couple 100,000 people, a couple thousand people, depending on, like, there's always reasons to create communities of Jesus followers. So my encouragement to you, you should be prepared for this question, but don't feel like you need to convince. That would be my encouragement to you.
Yeah, when I was first kind of getting into church planning and just ministry and that type of thing, before I kind of took a
hiatus. I love it.
Yep, hiatus, the English, to kind of pursue something else. I was one of those that would say, well, there's a church right down the street, or there was one right around the corner. And so now, since that's changed, my answer is like, so what? That's, encourage the other churches. Kind of going along with this, you need a compelling reason to plant a church in your area. Like, that's a false assumption. Like Dylan said, you don't feel like you have to give a reason. However, if one of your reasons is you've left a church in not a good way, even if it was kind of like silently to be passive aggressive, and then you plant something down the line because you want to do things your way, that's not a reason at all. Yeah. So that would be, you don't have to give a reason, but if you're not giving a reason because that is your reason, you should probably reconsider that notion. Yeah,
and I think this level too. Just imagine this: like, what is more compelling? Why are you planning a church? Well, there's X amount of people who don't go to church in our area, and there's how many churches closing their doors, and we want to fight against that. Or, hey man, I really love this community. I've been here for X number of years, or we're new to the community. We love Jesus, and here's a person or two that I've been meeting with, discipling, talking with, and we want to see more of that in this area. And that's just the reason. Yeah. Now, again, you can elaborate both of those. But I think the second one is just like, it just sounds more compelling. Even if it's not quote unquote convincing, it just sounds more compelling. And so I, again, prepared for this question because you might get some genuine answers. But I just remember we were planting New City. Granted, I was younger too. I just felt like I had to give a good reason for any question I have. And so saying I don't know is always maybe not for this question, but like saying I don't know or I'm not sure is when you get various questions about planting and that, that's okay to do that too. But you need a compelling reason to plant in your church in your area as a false ministry assumption. Now, I will say you do you do need a compelling reason why you're doing it.
Yes.
But in terms of like trying to convince someone, that's the point here. Just be honest about your love for people, love for the Lord, and you just want to see more people meet Him, and Again, we're big fans of not planting alone. So hopefully you've got a network, a denomination, a sending church, other people around you. But dude, I mean, for us, like right now, the place that we meet, like literally on the other side of the road, like not even a quarter mile, there's a really large church. So you could be like, well, why even have another one? It's like, you're right across the street. But it's like, again, Raleigh's a big area. Most people don't go to church. If everyone were to show up on a Sunday, which, wouldn't happen, but if a lot of people more people were to randomly show up on a Sunday than normal, where would they all go? Yeah. And so we need spaces and communities. So
what was really cool, real quick before we move on, is I was playing tennis with one of the pastors from that church across the street, and his comment was like, if there's anything that we can do to help you guys.
Yeah.
So that just shows just a healthy leadership, that we're just right across the street. They know we're smaller, but they also understand the same vision of we love God and we love people. And if people aren't convinced by that reasoning, they probably didn't want to know anyway. They were probably just wanting to be critical. So it's okay not to respond to stuff like that.
As a side note, this has nothing to do with anything. So the church across the street, their name is Providence Baptist. They have the URL pray.org. Like that's literally their website is pray.org. I don't know how they got it years ago. So I mean, it's not the most intuitive if you're looking it up, but man, that traffic, I cannot imagine. And to their credit, on their homepage, they have like a thing for prayer and that sort of thing. But I'm like,
hey, better if it's pray.org.
Yeah, right. But pray. Sorry, did I say prayer? I think it's pray.org, not prayer. It's pray.
You said pray.
Yeah, pray.org. I mean, I'm like, gosh, the traffic. I don't know how they got that. But anyway, we need churches to meet more people. And then let's see, that's number 5. Number 6, last but not least, that quick changes are always bad. Now, this is a little bit different than waiting is inherently more holy. So the first one we were talking about how you don't necessarily have to wait for everything. This might sound similar, but let me explain the difference. We're talking about if your church is doing something, you realize it's not working, and you need to change it. This assumption is, again, kind of the first one, you need to wait a little bit, or you need to give a lot of runway to let people know. When the reality is, if something needs to change, you should just go ahead and change it. It's okay if it's not like, you need to communicate it well and all these sort of things, but it's okay if it's not this like perfectly drawn out plan. Let me just give you a real example of how this has impacted me and how we've done things at New City. Year or two into New City, we were at our first space. Our space was really small, and so we were going to 2 services. And we were a smaller church, and so people hung out a lot. It was great. Community was awesome. So I figured we'd go to 2 services. We did roughly 60-minute-ish service, and so we'll do 9:15 and 11. We'll do 45 minutes between services. So 10:15 to 11-ish will be between the service because we're hanging out. Well, we did the first Sunday, and it was like too long. Like it just was. I don't know, just kind of, because, when you go from 1 to 2 services, there's less people at each one, and so some people leave right away, whatever. And so like, well, let's try it again. The second week, it was like very apparent that 45 minutes was too long. So we were talking to one of our elders, and I was like, I don't think this is going to work. Like, I guess we should announce it next week and then give it a couple weeks. And I'll never forget what he told me. He said there are many times in ministry, and of course this would apply to any organization or whatever, where for ministry, where people know there's a problem and they're wondering why the leadership isn't doing anything about it. I think part of it is because we feel like we have to wait. And so we decided after that service that the next Sunday we were doing 9:30 and 11. So in other words, we didn't have a Sunday to announce it. We didn't have like, hey, in 3 weeks, everybody get prepared. It was text, email, social media.
Here we go.
We're changing it. Now that might be, I get that's like not a church altering decision, but there's a tendency to be like, well, let's wait. So I'll give another example. I was talking to a guy a few weeks ago, or about a month ago. They went to 2 services, and he's like, man, it's just not working out. We need to go back to 1 for various reasons, long story short. And we talked on a Monday, and he's like, we've been doing it for about a month, and like, it's just not the same. Like they had to go to 2 services for kids space, not auditorium space. And so then it was just kind of felt dead. Yeah. And so we were talking through it. And again, we were talking through it, and I asked him what he wanted to do, going back to earlier. He said, I want to go to 1 service. And so again, this is part of, as the leader, I don't think there's necessarily a right or wrong, but he has got to be excited. And I said, if that's what you want to do, which by the way is what I would do, you should do it. And so without announcing, like they didn't wait like, hey, in 3 weeks, and so they could announce it the next couple of Sundays. It's text, email. Sometimes when it's a quick decision, it's actually better because people will talk about it more, and you can quote unquote promote it without sounding salesy because you want people to know. And here's the thing too, a lot of people don't come to church every week. So let's say you want to make a change and you want to wait 2 or 3 Sundays to do it so you can say it at church. Well, if people aren't there anyway, they're not going to hear it. So it's like you're waiting for the people who are going to potentially miss it anyway. So all that to say, again, you have to be cautious on this. If you're changing a lot of stuff all the time, that is a problem. So you can't be doing that. But if there's a thing that's like, hey, this isn't working out, we can make this change and we don't need to draw it out, I would encourage you to make those quick changes. I think that gives you credibility because you're doing what people are already thinking anyway. Or you're thinking you should do anyway.
Well, and there could be, I don't know how much more extra effort this would take. Maybe as you're planning a church, having a plan in place of what are certain decisions, like tiers of decisions, where these are ones I feel that we can make quickly because others are probably thinking the same thing. But there will be other decisions, bringing on new staff or something like that.
Right.
Where it's like, that's going to take a little bit of time. This is just against the assumption that quick changes are always bad every single time, and that's just not the truth.
Let me give you a real practical live New City Church example. This is kind of has to do with it. I don't know if this is helpful for you. I always like to hear what churches are doing. So real time, the dates aren't really important because this comes out a little bit after we record it, so it'll be confusing. We're talking about going back to 2 services. Our plan was the first week of April is our anniversary service for 6 years, and so I was telling people we're going to 2 services again back then. Well, January hit and it's been full every single week. And, it's probably like this for you. Post-COVID, attendance has been inconsistent.
Yes.
And so in the past, if we had 3 weeks of like the auditorium was pretty much full, it's time. We've had 3 weeks of that, and we're still kind of like, is it? So here's what we're doing. Talking about quick decisions. I don't know if this is helpful for you. We're basically deciding we're going to give it 4 weeks. We want to make sure that it's like full, not just like whatever. And then I'm going to have a graphic. We have our graphics guy. He's going to make us a graphic that says, hey, we're going to 2 services in 2 weeks. So it'll be this coming Sunday. We're going to announce that in 2 weeks. Yep. And the reason we're waiting 2 weeks is really for serve team purposes because, we're not, 50 people. So there is some like organizational stuff that you can't just like do super quick. And going from 1 to 2 is definitely more complex than going from 2 to 1. So here's what we're doing. We talk about it as a staff, and we're not going to mention anything till the end of service. I'm going to close the service, and if it's full, we're gonna say, hey, in 2 weeks we're going to 2 services. We got a graphic made on February 12th. But the reason why is we don't want to keep waiting. So we could say, hey, let's wait until after the church and talk about it, and if it's full, because then we have to wait again to like announce it. Because it's one thing to change your 2 service times. It's another thing altogether to go from 1 to 2 services. So if we're 4 weeks and we're just packed out, and we don't say anything, well, then we have to wait another week to say something, and then we still need to give our teams time to adjust. And so, like in real time, we're going to give ourselves 2 weeks, and we're literally making the decision like during the service.
Yep.
Our assumption is, it does help that our assumption is it's
going to happen.
Yeah, I mean, I'll honestly be really surprised. I mean, anything could happen. I would be really surprised if it wasn't. I mean, this past Sunday it was cold and rainy, and it was still really full for us. So that's what we're doing. It's like, again, quick decisions, real time. We're deciding during the service. I guess that means I'm deciding, but we'll know. I mean, it'll be really obvious, and then it's just 2 weeks, and then we're going to email the serve team. We're going to get all together. It's not going to be perfect right away, but I think there's grace for that too. I think sometimes we can get in this trap of everything has to be perfectly planned, all that stuff. Yes, you should do the best that you can do, but if something needs to change, you got to change, and then you figure it out as you're doing it.
Well, and if you're worried about people assuming that you don't have it all together. Spoiler, we don't. No one does. You do your best to make sure that you present something for people and give them an environment in which they can honor God and serve God and that type of thing. But it's don't always be worried about how it's going to go. You do what you can. Like we said earlier, you do what's in your control. You control anything outside of that. I think that's where God's grace comes in, and we need to lean on that more. Yeah.
So, quick changes are always bad as a false ministry assumption. So those are 6 false ministry assumptions. Hopefully they were helpful for you. Again, some things we mentioned in this episode, ministrysupport.com. Be sure to check them out. If you're on Facebook, join the Practical Church Planting Facebook group. Ask questions like these. We'd love to give you feedback. And we'll be with you next Wednesday on Practical Church Planting.
See you.